Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Caravaggio fought on September the 15th, 1448. This is a famous and pretty large condottieri clash in the critical moment of warfare between the Golden Ambrosian Republic, that is Milan, and the Republic of Venice. This engagement culminated in a series of skirmishes that began on July the 29th, 1448, in the area around Caravaggio, which held strategic importance in the lowlands of Bergamo. Today's video is the tactical analysis, in fact, of the last major confrontation during the siege, right, that the Venetians were trying to break in order to rescue the garrison in the town, surrounded by the Milanese that had dug in, prompting also, in fact, their enemies to do the same in this attempt to sort of test the ground, the enemy resolve, etc. The battle's context shifted dramatically following the death of Filippo Maria Visconti, the Duke of Milan, on August the 13th, 1447, who left no heirs. The next day, a group of Milanese nobles established the Golden Ambrosian Republic, which had Ghibelline leanings and opposed Venice. However, this new governance struggled for legitimacy, facing challenges from Parma and Pavia, which declared independence, from Milan, and Lodi and Piacenza, that openly allied with Venetians. To address the fragmentation of the former Duchy of Milan, the Golden Ambrosian Republic mobilized its citizens and appointed the notable condottiere Francesco Sforza, husband of Bianca Maria Visconti, as military leader on September the 3rd. Sforza planned to invade the Bergamasque plains to push Venetian forces beyond the Oglio River and encircle Lodi and Caravaggio. However, Ambrosian leaders pressured Sforza to limit his advance to the Adda River for a quicker resolution due to scarce resources. Complying reluctantly, Sforza regrouped his troops near Cremona and sent a detachment led by Giovanni da Camerino to guard Caravaggio from Venetian capture. There are lots of different names here. These are at large condottieri at the head of their own companies, in service, in this case, of Milan. So it's important to stress that the Battle of Caravaggio witnessed the presence of some of the most important condottieri of the era that in fact would have been protagonistic for the following 20 years in Italian warfare. We'll talk more about the condottieri because I realize we sort of neglected much this era, and I instead realized there's a lot of interest from your side about the topic. Do not forget to look at actually previous Italian warfare because it's actually more important than this one. However, it's understandable that the condottieri have been popularized more given the historiographical reasons, both in Italy and abroad, for which this period has been, if not privileged, at least chosen first, and the previous one left a bit behind due to the wide complexity, in fact, of the latter. In any case, let's go back to the narrative here, the background to the battle. Despite these efforts, on July the 28th, 1448, Venetian forces under Ludovico Malvezzi and Matteo di Capua, the other condottieri, supported by 700 men-at-arms and 800 infantry, successfully defended Caravaggio, expelling suspected Milanese supporters from the town. Sforza had established a fortified camp near Caravaggio and positioned his artillery for a siege. The situation prompted a Venetian response. Under Micheletto Attendolo, that was Sforza's own cousin, the main Venetian army established a camp a few miles east of Sforza's position. The vulnerability of the Milanese state intensified the urgency for the Venetians as the campaigning season waned. Micheletto favored a cautious approach despite pressure from Venetian leaders urging an offensive against the Milanese position. He recognized the risks of attacking the well-fortified Milanese camp. Nonetheless, dissenting Venetian condottieri, as we will see now, particularly Bartolomeo Coglioni and Tiberto Brandolini, assessed Sforza's reliance on a marshy wood impassable for cavalry, and advocated for an attack influencing Venetian commanders to proceed with their assault. As we will see, these very condottieri would change ideas and would support Attendolo later on, and this is essentially what most of the battle revolves around, because there were still other minor condottieri, less experienced, less famous ones, that thought that a way across that swampy forested territory was practicable to attack a weaker part of the Milanese fortifications, and resulting, in fact, in the almost Venetian success in this clash, but I won't spoiler further. So, on July the 29th, after 5 days of marching, the Milanese army arrived near Caravaggio, while the Venetian army camped close to Romano. Caravaggio was defended by a mile-long wall, a flooded moat, and a now-absent castle at the northwestern corner. Upon arrival, Francesco Sforza learned of the approaching Venetian army and decided to establish a fortified camp 2 crossbow shots from the town walls. He laid siege to the castle and bombarded it with artillery, positioning most of his troops on the eastern side of the town and assigning command to various leaders. As you will see from the map, essentially the Milanese army was sandwiched between Caravaggio and the trenches that they dug themselves in order to defend themselves from the arrival of the Venetians from the northeast. Milanese reinforcements added approximately 4,000 cavalry and hundreds of infantry. We will see now essentially what the broader forces are. There is a bit of difficulty in the reconstruction, especially of the infantry forces, but they were likely as many as the cavalry, and so rather in the thousands. These were stationed east along the road to Fornovo San Giovanni, effectively encircling Caravaggio. Sforza, noticing the Venetian army at the Oglio River, ordered the roads to Caravaggio blocked and began digging ditches and trenches for camp protection while constructing a road for better access between Caravaggio and Fornovo. Fornovo, at the eastern edge of the Milanese camp, had partial fortifications, with its eastern side protected by the moat and a marshy wooded area. Sforza also planned to build a mobile bridge over the moat west of the town. On July the 30th, Venetian troops camped near Marengo, northeast of Caravaggio. The next morning, Sforza, after leaving a contingent to continue the siege, moved his cavalry toward Marengo. During these movements, he found the Venetians had crossed Marengo and reached the Fosso Bergamasco, the boundary between the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice. Thus the invasion had begun. The Milanese cavalry engaged the Venetian infantry at the Fosso, but encountered challenges from enemy crossbowmen behind a nearby ditch. This is a bit the characteristic of 15th century European warfare. There is a great deal of fortifications, of positional warfare, the increased use of especially firearms. There were also arquebusiers involved here. And if you're interested in the broader art of war of the period, you can check out my videos about, in fact, each century, or generally speaking, late medieval warfare for more perspective. Sforza at this point sent 2 infantry units led by Jacopo Piccinino, other famous condottiere of the time, to support the cavalry, leading to 2 hours of fighting. Meanwhile, Venetian commander Micheletto Tendolo hesitated to attack due to the strong Milanese defenses, despite mixed counsel from his advisors. Bartolomeo Coglioni, which literally means testicles, when you literally have balls on your own coat of arms, and Tiberto Brandolini, these are famous leaders, advised him to strike the less fortified eastern side of Fornovo that had already been identified at this point in the campaign as the weaker one, Eventually, Attendolo resolved to advance, motivated by the necessity for a decisive victory as the rainy season approached. And the main Venetian force, led by Guido Rangoni, moved past Bariano towards Fornovo to assault the Milanese camp. Aware of the threat to his camp's vulnerable eastern flank, Sforza ordered Francesco Piccinino to provide support. However, Piccinino, wary of Sforza's orders, hesitated, leading to missed opportunities against the Venetians. Piccinino was a bit unloyal to Sforza's cause, issue that was hidden from the rest of the army by the same Sforza due to morale reasons. By afternoon, Sforza assembled his own troops and prepared for action, while the Venetians fortified their position. Sforza strengthened the battlefield defenses by constructing a deep wide ditch with a robust rampart. In response, the Venetians dug a trench and arranged their troops defensively behind it. It's very interesting to see how this happened all in a day. I mean, what kind of military engineering capacity was provided by these armies, pioneers, in combat conditions. As the sun set, Sforza launched an offensive with newly arrived arquebusiers. The battle unfolded amid thick smoke and varied weaponry, resulting in many Venetians dead or injured. This aspect is very important because, as we will see at the end of the video, not just we know little about the casualties from this massive engagement, but there is also the vexata question of the alleged bloodless condottieri clashes that is instead debunked by just even the smaller engagements. These were incredibly brutal, violent, and deadly engagements. And if anything, at the end we will wrap this topic up a bit better. In any case, despite their fierce resistance, the Venetians were eventually compelled to retreat by nightfall, while Sforza ordered his troops to withdraw after filling the trench. This was very important to settle, in fact, the background, especially the field fortifications around which the Battle of Caravaggio would be finally fought. Determined not to capitulate despite their loss, the Venetians believed the Ambrosian Republic couldn't finance its campaign until autumn. Hence, they were motivated to simply stay and see the Milanese army melt away in the ensuing weeks. The Venetians enlisted numerous crossbowmen from Dalmatia, German mercenaries, and more troops from Brescia and Bergamo. These Lombard cities were also contended between Milan and Venice at some point. You know that the Venetians had expanded in the early 15th century into northern Italy by creating this massive terra firma dominion that arrived, in fact, as close as Bergamo to Milan. So we're talking about a few tens of kilometers, all in all. You see the Venetians drawing, due to their financial capacity, mercenaries from the Balkans, where you have a bit more missile troops. You have this German men-at-arms that are always useful. At large, however, these armies are composed by Italians. By this point, it was true in the age of the condottieri since the 70s, the 80s of the previous century. We explained this in a recent video we made on the condottieri as a broader introduction to the period. You have this communal forces, the cernide, the provisional infantries as well, that are essentially some semi-professional infantry forces at large that definitely stiffen the numerical backbone of these hosts, especially in such heavily fortified terrain. You really do need these troops next to the heavier men-at-arms. Also, of course, the Venetians bolstered their cavalry because still, of course, the mounted army was the most important one, right? It's a myth, really, that in late medieval warfare, infantry was the prevailing arm. During most of the period, it was always cavalry to dictate the rules, let's say. without mentioning that the men-at-arms were the veritable stormtroopers of the situation, the one who would lead the assaults of the fortified entrenchments by dismounting. We will see partly this for the Battle of Caravaggio. The Venetians returned near Marengo, constructing new trenches for defense. We're talking about here a battlefield stretching for kilometers, right? So it's also a very big engineering work to protect with different layers of trenches the respective camps. On August the 14th, the Milanese executed a surprise attack on the Venetian camp, leading to intense fighting and injuries among some leaders. Although the Milanese inflicted further losses on the Venetians, Sforza became concerned about supply and financial shortages, causing unrest and defections within his ranks. The Ambrosian Republic, in fact, pressed him for updates, and some officers urged him to discontinue the very campaign. In search of weaknesses in the enemy's defenses, Tiberto Brandolini infiltrated the Milanese lines and identified vulnerable areas near Fornovo. On September the 5th, Sforza ordered strikes on the increasingly defenseless castle of Caravaggio, the garrison of which was gradually dwindling. He considered dividing his forces, but ultimately decided to wait for the castle's defenders to surrender, thus prompting the Venetians to attack his quite solid positions. In the Venetian camp, thus a war council, we will see better later in detail, convened to evaluate strategies for saving Caravaggio, with various captains suggesting different approaches for a retreat, attack, or fortification. Ultimately, the Venetian Senate would approve a plan proposed by Tiberto Brandolini to attempt assistance for Caravaggio that, as you understand, would essentially head for the weaker part of the Milanese fortifications near Fornovo. So this is the general background to the battle. You understand how intense this fight had been. There had been a lot of back and forth. The Milanese were technically the besieged ones, at least at this point, by besieging Caravaggio, and so essentially being pinned there. But they also tried to test the Venetian positions in the moment in which the enemy approaches, and more or less the situation is frozen along the fortifications that are erected at the beginning of the campaign. The entire point was a race against time for both, given that Caravaggio was not to last forever, nor, however, the Milanese supplies were, because the Ambrosian Republic was not willing just to keep sustaining so that the army indefinitely. They didn't have resources, and autumn was coming. Now, let's look at the numbers involved, because much, of course, of this Iron Arm can be understood on the basis of the general balance of forces that apparently existed between the two armies, and regardless of the different narratives given by the contemporary chroniclers. So the reported troop numbers during the 15th century siege of Caravaggio highlight this consistent, in fact, issue in historical military accounts, as these figures often vary due to the author's sources, political biases, and nationalistic feelings, complicating the determination of actual forces involved. However, narrative sources are also generally reliable regarding the broader scale of the engagement, and they're the inescapable evidence that we must base ourselves on for understanding this kind of battles that are, in fact, quite big, right? For all people who say, medieval battles were small. Yet here, check out, Italian war and the incidents of armies in the tens of thousands on a regular basis that nobody popularizes for some reason. So we'll now cite and quote different authors. One is, for example, Giovanni Simonetta, a contemporary biographer of Francesco Sforza, who estimates the Milanese military at 12,000 cavalry and 3,000 infantry, noting that the Venetian forces were slightly larger, with 12,500 cavalry and 5,000 infantry. I took Simonetta's cavalry estimates for good by approximation, essentially showing that, predictably, the Milanese and Venetians had essentially the same amount of troops at large. The story is a bit different for infantry because we have less evidence about the foot and other types of troops other than the men-at-arms around which the condottieri age revolved around, but more of this now. Importantly, these estimates only reflect the final encounter, by the way, and do not factor in earlier casualties both sides experienced, which may mean, of course, that there were slightly less. However, as we'll see now, there were other troops coming to the theater of the confrontation with significant changes in numbers. Historians such as Bernardino Corio and Giovan Pietro Cagnola later echoed Simonetta's numbers in their works. These are 16th century chroniclers. Conversely, the Venetian chronicler Marco Antonio Sabellico presented a different viewpoint, claiming the Venetian army had 12,000 cavalry against 16,000 Milanese men-at-arms, likely inflating, in fact, the Ambrosian numbers to rationalize Venice's defeat, but still essentially confirming the overall numbers like this 12,000, and by scale also an equality between the two hosts. The Florentine historian Giovanni Cambi reported over 16,000 Venetian cavalry instead, and a large infantry contingent, thus balancing things further, while Niccolò della Tuccia from Viterbo, in the north of Rome, exaggerated the numbers dramatically, but still with some logic that I will explain now, claiming around 30,000 Sforza troops and Venetian forces of 18,000 cavalry and infantry, each that is a total of 36,000. Subsequent historians continued to offer varying troop strength estimates. Ercole Ricotti were in the 19th century suggested 13,000 Milanese cavalry and 3,000 infantry, while Sismondi and Ariodante Fabretti correlated with Simonetta. Cristoforo da Soldo, an eyewitness and captain of Brescia's guards, provided detailed records of Venetian captains and their forces, noting approximately 9,950 cavalry and 7,000 infantry prepared for warfare in Lombardy by late 1447, so the year before. This included cavalry reinforcements from Ludovico Gonzaga, the Marquis of Mantua, and additional cavalry joining in May, which confirms a bit the scale, given that those reinforcements were roughly adding up to 12,000 men-at-arms. So reinforcing again the notion that more or less the Venetians in this case, but also the Milanese from another side, would have been around 12,000 men-at-arms, and actually several thousand infantrymen at least. The problem with infantry, as we'll see later, is that you never fully understand how many of these troops are actually fighting force, or they're part of the condotte, or maybe they're, some other forces are being excluded from the account. And Da Soldo's records reveal shifts in troop size, suggesting that Venice's cavalry would total around 13,450. However, not all forces would be present at Caravaggio due to losses and obligations to other posts, because the account of Da Soldo, as we've seen, considers the entire regional theater. By the end of the pivotal battle, Da Soldo recorded 12,000 Venetian cavalry, so reinforcing again that number. And so we think, again, we can be reasonably sure about especially the men-at-arms strength. Regarding infantry, Brescia contributed 6,000 select soldiers, and Bergamo added another 3,000. So if we count them, we realize that they come close to an equivalence to the men-at-arms themselves. This is essentially what I decided to reconstruct for the battle myself. You'll see in the map. I don't know where it starts, but let's say it's 12,000 cavalry and 12,000 infantry for both sides. All right. Nonetheless, heavy fighting led to significant losses before the battle, particularly among elite troops as well. D'Assoldo also noted a considerable number of non-combatants, such as engineers and support staff, bringing the overall force to approximately 36,000 when including these figures, which, if you remember, aligns closely with Tucci's exaggerated count, despite the likelihood of overstatement in these totals, that I do not really think were overstatement. If you consider especially field aids, saddler trained, or all this stuff, like, you would have this kind of numbers. It was a massive engagement, and it deserves credit. In fact, not just also for the strategic prowess of the contendants, but also for their logistical capacities. Chroniclers from this period often excluded non-combatants from troop counts as well, creating sometimes a distorted view of the entire, in fact, force mobilized and sustained. They also frequently overlooked certain units, leading to inaccuracies in casualty reports that complicate the understanding of the dynamics during the siege of Caravaggio. You have different companies, you have different leaders that join the army, and also other minor units that would have come from other places of the respective dominions. D'Assoldo's account of the Milanese army were less comprehensive than those concerning the Venetians. He recorded that Francesco Sforza launched an assault on the Venetians with 6,000 cavalry and 3,000 infantry after crossing the Adda River at Pizzighettone on August the 31st, 1447, though. By early August 1448, he reported an additional 10,000 select troops joining the Milanese forces, which also seems to account for, in fact, over that number as a general foot strength, adding up to my side, say, of the reconstruction. Following the siege on September the 23rd, by the way, Sforza camped near Brescia with over 10,000 cavalry, while the Piccinino brothers advanced toward Lodi with 4,000 cavalry, which would suggest even a larger men-at-arms force, perhaps, for the Milanese. So, in any case, we have pretty well-balanced forces, right? And we have reason to understand why these contendants were so hesitant to take on one another, and how bold eventually the Venetian move really was, leading, in fact, to the disaster. However, the Venetians also came pretty close to victory, given the strategic acumen that they had possessed, even in an ultimately wrong decision. When you look at the broader context, you have to realize, of course, the political mandate here. You have, for example, the figure of the Venetian commissioners, or provveditori, so provisioners of some sort, that were essentially appointed by local lords to oversee military operations and mercenaries. Venice had her own. At the time of the Battle of Marengo, for example, the Venetian provveditori included Almorò Donato and Federico Contarini. The latter, however, shortly after arriving, suffered a fatal dog bite and was taken to Brescia for treatment, where he later died because of rabies. It was a rabid dog. So it's that random and not very like a good omen at large for the Venetian cause. Now, in the wake of his death, Gherardo Dandolo took over his duties and convened a council with Donato to discuss future actions. That's where the Venetian plan is highly discussed, but ultimately decided for action. This council involved extensive discussions lasting several days, as recorded by the historian Sabellico, Disagreements among the leaders were common, leading to a decision that each captain would present written proposals for the Venetian state's evaluation that would have to eventually green light one of them. The commander-in-chief, Micheletto Tendolo, was the first to suggest a strategic retreat to Martinengo, believing this would enable the Venetians to withstand the siege and position themselves for a successful counterattack. He foresaw that if the enemy captured Caravaggio, it would lead to looting that could disrupt their forces and present an opportunity for the Venetians. Ludovico Gonzaga, the Marquis of Mantua, raised concerns about the impracticality of immediate assistance to Caravaggio due to challenging terrain. He also noted disunity among Milanese captains resulting from financial difficulties that hindered reinforcements. He proposed that the Venetians occupy Mozzanica to apply indirect pressure on Sforza's troops while delaying the siege of Caravaggio, prioritizing the safety of the Venetian army over engagement in treacherous terrain. Bartolomeo Coglioni similarly stressed the army's safety in his proposal and agreed with Gonzaga that the enemy would struggle to maintain their forces for more than a month due to supply shortages. Niccolò Guerriero suggested relocating the Venetian camp between Treviglio and Brignano to support the besieged and disrupt the enemy's supply lines from Milan. So all these condottieri were essentially stating that the Milanese would have worn themselves out by continuing the siege of Caravaggio, the fall of which would have also not actually improved their strategic and logistical situation, while in fact a still strong Venetian army could relocate on stronger position and even trying to cut the supply lines from Milan itself. Many captains, including Gentile da Leonessa, Roberto da Monte Albotto, Cesare da Martinengo, Guido Rangone, Carlo Fortebracci, Jacopo Catalano, and Cristoforo da Tolentino, backed instead Tiberto Brandolini's plan that we have already hinted at. Brandolini had in fact identified a new route, even a better one, that could aid the rescue of Caravaggio. And even more, like just to knock out the Milanese army altogether in one assault. These captains were known as the Marcheschi for their loyalty to the Serenissima Republic, that is, to Republic of San Mark, hence Marcheschi, the Marquesque essentially, argued that losing Caravaggio could lead to Lodi's fall and pose serious risks to Venice. Instead, they believed Brandolini's route could facilitate a successful assault on the enemy camp and lead to victory, not just tactically but strategically, and essentially managing to take over Milan, that would have at that point remained without an army to defend itself. After gathering these views, the Venetian Provveditori submitted them to the Venetian Senate, which ultimately approved only the Marcheschi's proposal, leading to orders for the Provveditori to implement this strategy. This is extremely important because it shows how the majority of the Venetian condottieri had opted for a more cautious approach that could avert significant threats, especially to the integrity of the Venetian army. So that even if, in the case that Brandolini was making, that the fall of Caravaggio could have strengthened the Sforza's position in Lombardy, with other cities coming back once again under the Ambrosian signory, the Venetian host could have still really pressed on the enemy, that would have kept having significant financial and logistical shortcomings. And instead, the political directive from the Senate of Venice that really wanted to get it over with, like to crush Milan once for all, backed the, if you want, the least experienced part of the condottieri to risk everything into this very bold but potentially very successful attack that could have knocked out entirely again the Milanese forces and leading to a crushing victory for Venice. I also made a video about the Battle of Molinella that was fought decades later, that however highlights how close the Venetians, not just the Milanese, especially in the previous period, but the Venetians at this point were to practically overrun all northern central Italy, and leading to something like at least a unification of the Italic kingdom at that point. But in fact, these efforts were thwarted by mostly, in fact, the Milanese leadership and the one of its allies in these very, thus politically and strategically relevant engagements. That's why the Battle of Caravaggio, aside from the size and, as we'll see now, also the tactics are very interesting, is such a relevant episode in the annals of military history. So let's get to the battle proper. Briefly, and not that importantly, historians are divided on the date of the battle. As for others, the other day I made a video about the Battle of Marathon. There is a controversy there between the 10th, the 11th, the 12th of September, even of August for that matter, depending on how you count the calendar there. In any case, as far as Caravaggio is concerned, some assert that the clash occurred on Sunday, September the 15th, 1448, which is the date we chose for this video, while others, including Simonetta, argue for the day before, September the 14th. The majority of scholars support the 15th, although Simonetta's writings and those of Venetian chroniclers suggest the battle may have happened during a festive day, contributing to the dispute. Dasoldo advocates for the 15th as well, while Milanese historians Cagnola and Corio align with Simonetta's view. Giovanni Cambi and Gaspare Broglio della Tuccia, along with an anonymous Veronese chronicler, also favor the 15th. Later, historians like Fabretti, Ricotti, Muratori, and Sismondi have generally upheld this date, a consensus maintained by contemporary scholarship, so there is not much of an issue regarding it. Dasoldo states the Venetian army began to deploy at dawn, though Simonetta claims this happened before noon. In any case, in the morning, the troops followed the route used by Tiberto Brandolini, that, as you see in the picture, follows the swampy and forested terrain towards Fornovo, so the weaker part of the Milanese fortifications. Brandolini was securing the camp with Coglioni, so leaving this major condottiere behind in a very important position, as we will see by the end of the battle. Coglioni would command 1,500 cavalry and much of the infantry. In fact, Coglioni was charged with bombarding the enemy and engaging in skirmishes, so to keep him busy, to distract him, while the bulk of the Venetian men-at-arms would perform this major outflanking maneuver towards the southwest, so betting the entire army on this operation. Leading the vanguard were Brandolini, Gentile da Leonessa, and Alberto di Montalbotto themselves. This made a lot of sense because they had been the main proponents of the plan. Brandolini was the guy who had recognized the path to advance on and the positions to attack. He had been there in disguise, interestingly enough. It's considered the general courage of these individuals, and these were valid condottieri. Gentile da Leonessa is also famous. Now, the general captain of the Venetian army, Micheletto Tendolo, and Ludovico Gonzaga followed this vanguard, this path openers, the spearhead, commanding additional forces and essentially the bulk of the reserves during the attack. Contrarily, however, Sabellico and Venetian chroniclers name Guido Rangone as the vanguard leader instead of Leonessa. Pandolfo Nassino, is another source, mentions that the Venetian forefront consisted of broken lances from the Gatteschi and the Tolentini, suggesting with participation from Leonessa's forces, the Brandolini brothers, and Cristoforo dal Tolentino. These names are, as we will see now also for these Sforzeschi and the Bracceschi, some particular groups of condottieri, some essentially connected to different political affiliations, clienteles, or ways of war, especially the Sforzeschi and Bracceschi that now are on the Milanese side, were at time also rival against one another, and especially these terms describe this different tactical approaches on which a bit too much categorism has frankly been made, but we will surely make a video on that specific topic at a point. Now, on that Sunday, assuming it was Sunday the 15th, Francesco Sforza was praying at the church of Santa Maria of Caravaggio near his camp, obviously on the holy day, when soldiers from Captain Moretto informed him that the enemy was mobilizing. Look at the spaces. We're talking kilometers of distance here, that the commander is in the rear lines following the siege, and something starts happening, right? The explorers report of the enemy movements. Sforza quickly dispatches his brother Corrado and Roberto Sanseverino, another condottiere, with 4 cavalry units and some infantry to support Moretto in his assessment of the situation. Sforza also ordered nearby Bracceschi troops to stay alert and instructed all other armed men to prepare their horses and arms, though without armor, not to strain the mounts too much. That was an important practice. If you look at the kind of panoply that a man-at-arms would have now from the beautiful Italian art of the period, you realize the overwhelming weight of these armor. We're in the peak of armoredness in military history, like the 15th century, with full plate armor. This is interesting as well. The Bracceschi would eventually remain on the left side, mostly on the left side of the Milanese line, so leading eventually to the counterattack to the Venetian camp, while that had remained weakened by the participation of nearly all the men-at-arms to that outflanking maneuver. While dining with his secretary Cicco Simonetta, that's the same source that would know better what was going on, Sforza alerted by scouts that the enemy was moving towards Mozzanica. So at this point, things were starting to get clearer. He recalled the foragers in the area and sent Donato da Milano to confirm the movement of the Venetians. And within Sforza's camp, opinions differed. Yeah, the guy was in charge, of course, it was the commander-in-chief, but you had, as we've seen also from the Venetian side, all this other condottieri expressing their own opinion, also because these were the leaders of the respective companies that would have had to be motivated in order to act. Some thought the Venetians aimed to take Mozzanica, while others felt that the enemy were trying to retreat before Caravaggio fell. Sforza doubted these views, noting that the enemy left a strong garrison behind even after abandoning their camp. So an attack on Mozzanica would have really not matched with any particular advantage of the Venetian forces, because it was beyond, as you see from the map, their fortified emplacement. They could have held it, could have created this sort of nasty presence on the right flank of the Milanese positions, also coming closer to Caravaggio. However, this would have just been a risk without an actual confrontation, or just waiting for the Milanese to react. No, from a strategical point of view, there was something bigger going on. Sforza thus ordered now everyone to arm themselves, with a small group lacking weapons proceeded towards Fornovo. Before, he had just mobilized the reserves. Now he was mobilizing everyone, and he needed to travel light, at least with his guard, just to rush to the to the place of the Venetian attack and assessing what to do and directing the confluence of forces there in case. Shortly after Donato arrived, reporting the enemy was advancing towards Fornovo with full force and that their infantry had crossed the woods, reaching the poorly defended Milanese positions located in a swampy area. Right, so now it was really clear. It's also very interesting that the Venetians had been using infantry to cross the woods because they feared themselves some ambush, and as you will see, they wouldn't be actually without reason in that. But they would pave the way to the heavies in this tough terrain. The Venetian foot soldiers swiftly seized these positions, which were leveled by engineers to clear the way for their cavalry. You have this in medieval battles. You have, as soon as troops arrive, there are some guys that literally clear the way from everything, like from bushes, from stones, other obstacles, and leaving the ground open for the cavalry, especially, to operate. On the morning of the assault, D'Assoldo recounted that the Venetians began by creating distractions in the northern area through skirmishes. They then moved most of their troops along a new route through the marshy land, but faced challenges as their cavalry struggled to maneuver, proving less effective than their infantry. This was the great gamble, the great problem of it all. Like, could the men-at-arms flow smoothly to the Milanese fortifications through such a difficult terrain, and especially arrived at that point being able to effectively deploy and inject reserves in combat. A chronicler from Brescia noted that this Wemp's difficulty for the Venetian cavalry as a significant factor in their defeat. After hearing updates from Donato about the battle, the Count Francesco Sforza swiftly returned to his men, ordering them to prepare and instructing Francesco Piccinino to dispatch 4 cavalry squadrons while the others held their positions. Sforza then directed his brother Corrado and other commanders to inspect the defenses of a key trench that had been reinforced with a bridge and barriers. Shortly after, he called for Alessandro Sforza, who had arrived with reinforcements from Pesaro in the Marches, to oversee the bridge at a trench that Simonetta mentioned Brandolini had overlooked during his reconnaissance, the same trench the Venetians were, unfortunately for them, advancing toward. The Venetians, propelled by urgency and battle cries, charged, however, so fiercely that the Milanese defenders struggled to withstand their assault. This was a critical moment of the battle. Really, during the clash, Alessandro Sforza and his forces who had engaged the Venetians beyond the trench that had really been crossed were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Right, so essentially these forces' defenses were giving way. The Venetians had managed through planks, through filling the ditches, to bring enough men inside the Milanese fortifications, and they were keeping them pouring in. Among the fleeing was Carlo Gonzaga, who suffered a lance wound near his eye. Pretty dangerous. However, he feigned greater injury and fled back to camp, quickly riding to Milan to report the alleged Sforza's defeat. Not much of a honorable behavior, but he wanted to be justified, at least in what was surely a doubt by that point. However, this detail tells you how desperate the situation appeared on the Milanese right. It seemed as if the entire line was now to collapse. However, the fight went on. It was pretty intense. In the midst of combat, Manno Barile was, as we've seen from the Milanese side, unseated and captured by Gentile da Leonessa's troops. As he was taken away, brought across the Venetian posterior lines, he faced mockery from other condottieri, including the same Micheletto and Ludovico Gonzaga, who taunted him about his side's defeat. he told him, "It seems, Manno, that your men are broken." And Manno answered this, that is the most beautiful line from the battle, that is, "Rather you who are led to a place from which you won't leave without a broken head," which is exactly what would happen, right? So, yes, my condotta is broken, but your army will be destroyed. And this is a terrifying statement. Even better if you hear the Italian original. Now, despite a rocky start, the battle initially leaned in favor of the Venetians. Again, they had issues in bringing the men-at-arms across the woods, the swamps that had been predictable. However, the operation had ultimately succeeded, and now, they having reached the Milanese fortifications, they had even managed to break the enemy lines and swarming inside. It was a matter of going on in the fight and holding. D'Asoldo noted that the Sforza forces were so rattled they nearly broke ranks entirely, forcing the Serenissimo's men to pursue them even into their own pavilions. The chronicler Pandolfo Nassino remarked that the Marquesian troops could have supported their allies in the Duke's camp had been entirely overrun. Nevertheless, Venetian troops, including the Gathese and the Tolentini, advanced powerfully into the enemy's defenses, achieving an unprecedented victory. Fighting intensified around the trench and bridge, where fierce clashes were still occurring. The trench's narrow, shallow design made it challenging for the Venetians to break through, but they pressed on, determined to cross and occupy the bridge. Numerous soldiers were wounded on both sides as fresh fighters continued to join the fray from both sides. Imagine all forces concentrating at that point. The Sforzas were essentially holding the Milanese right, so the Bracceschi were left in reserve on the, let's say, on the left, but it's not like they could simply intervene, like couldn't simply go through the same. Sforzeschi would have messed everything up, so now it was all on the latter, right, to hold the right and prevent this major Venetian breakthrough that would have essentially swept away every Milanese resistance. At a critical juncture, Simonetta highlighted the bravery of Fiasco and Rossetto da Capua for the Sforza forces. There were also many southern Italians, by the way, in the account, because the condottieri were quite, international or national, at least in this context. Meanwhile, troops in Caravaggio, the Venetian garrison, alerted by the sounds of battle and the attackers' shouts, prepared to support their Marquesian allies, however, without getting much anywhere, given that the Venetian breakthrough wouldn't ultimately happen, and the Caravaggio garrison would have been just a small force at best to attack the Milanese from the rear, had been the enemy fully occupied with the Venetians on the other side. Count Sforza actively moved across the battlefield, urgently calling for reinforcements and encouraging his troops at the trench while bolstering those guarding the castle. That could have really presented some issue. Once at his tent, he donned only his breastplate, quickly remounted his horse, and returned to the fight. Given how necessary his leadership was at the site, even before his physical incolumitty. Upon arrival on the battleground, he noticed Venetian troops advancing on the right flank. He positioned himself there and spotted Roberto da Montalbotto, remember one of the greater proponents of the attack, was successfully leading it, trying to breach the Milanese defenses. Roberto, recognizing the Count, shouted, "Oh, Count, you will not leave today without hot water," which I think is an expression meaning like you will be badly beaten, of course, but I think referred to the wound treatment of some sort, or it's a broader metaphor that here I can't catch. And Francesco replied, quote, "You are in place, Roberto. You won't depart unless you first contend with the enemy." Just meaning, you have to really take into account we're still halting you and we're here to stop you. Don't give for granted your victory, which is exactly like what this was all about. Imagine the confidence even from the Marcheschi side in having, first of all, wanted to and succeeded in leading this attack against the Milanese camp. Francesco observed 2 of his fresh reinforcement squads arriving, commanded by Mariano di Calabria and Guido Turco, both adept leaders in the Sforza ranks. He quickly directed them towards a poorly guarded trench entrance, launching an attack on a nearby enemy unit and effectively pushing them back. So essentially a sortie, right, that would unbalance, in fact, the broader Venetian assault front. The Venetian forces were keeping to struggle with the terrain, which restricted their movement and combat capabilities. Really, the Milanese had envisaged the possibility that the Venetians could attack from Fornova, from the direction of Fornova, but they thought that it would have been impossible just to maneuver, to operate in the precipitant terrain that was so swampy and forested. So now they were paying, of course, for their lack of care, as their fortifications were weak there, and there were also, scarce troops to defend them, at least at the beginning. However, the Venetians were equally paying for such bold choice. The historian Sanuto noted that shortly after, the Count Francesco arrived with his own fresh troops. These chronicles, of course, do not follow the same narrative, but the sense is that Sforza had brought in his bodyguard, rallying them against the enemy. The wetlands hindered the Venetian operational effectiveness. Sensing their disadvantage, Francesco rushed to the bridge, urging his men to charge. Leading by example, caught off guard by the dual assault, remember there had been some guys who had managed to come out from the same Milanese fortification and attacking the Venetians from the flank. The Venetians fled in chaos like sheep, while the Sforza forces pursued and captured many. So at some point the Venetians break, and we'll understand now how there was some more complex and shrewd maneuver from the Sforza side. In fact, it was a flank attack that the Venetians had rightfully feared, and that the Sforza had adeptly predisposed, or at least allowed for taking position before the attack. Nassino remarked that Sforza's troops attacked the wary Venetians with such ferocity that it compelled them to flee across the narrow bridge, while the wetlands blocked most escape routes, resulting in a near total capture of those heading back towards their own camp, or trying to escape in the open towards Fornova along the same Milanese lines, because on the Venetian right you have essentially the forest, as you can see from the map, and then their own entrenchment, so they would have tried to link up with Corleone's forces. Gentile da Leonessa and Roberto da Monte Albodo, finding their horses stuck in the swamp, abandoned them and fled on foot, only to be soon apprehended. Consider again the heaviness of these massively, armored men at arms. I made a video about the Milanese, actually Italian armor. You can imagine how treacherous such a terrain for such heavy troops would be. This feels also sort of a retribution, given that these had been the leaders of the assault, those that had basically endangered and now lost the entire Venetian army. Observing their plight, the Count consoled them with assurances of mercy, anyway, there was this sense of liberality, of courtesy, of chivalry, by which Sforza, so for broader political reasons, did not want to terrorize his prisoners. On the contrary, like showing mercy and, still having them under his control. Meanwhile, Sforza's soldiers stationed at Mozzanica, witnessing the Venetian defeat, charged at the retreating troops. These were the aforementioned hidden reserves of some sort that Sforza had sent to essentially cut off the Venetian retreat in order to attack the enemy from the flank, from the rear. To manage the capture of prisoners, Sforza halted his banners and instructed his brother Alessandro and Guglielmo di Monferrato to protect them against any resurgence of enemy forces. Because there was a concrete risk here of being suffering counterattacks or something. You couldn't really see well beyond that terrain. I mean, the Coglionis positioned were well inside. There was an open ground, all the fortifications. By the way, the Milanese and the Venetians were bombarding each other from that side. But from the forest side, there would have not even been too much reason other than pursuing the enemy than entering that, and you had to be careful anyway. Sforza then ordered Luigi del Verme, Cristoforo Torelli, and Count Dolce to oversee the troops looting the defeated army, ensuring no atrocities occurred against the vanquished, which was also part of Sforza's policy at this point. More about the losses later. There is an alternative version by D'Assoldo describing the Venetian forces' defeat, emphasizing Sforza's strategic maneuvers. Right, and this is, in fact, the main source effectively proposing the idea that Francesco Sforza had previously sent, before the battle even began, a cavalry battalion to the enemy's rear, which, unnoticed in the woods, created chaos among the Venetian lines when struck from behind. The remaining Venetian forces, largely ignorant of this stratagem, began abandoning their positions, resulting in a complete rout. And if Sforza really did that, which is also likely, he was really a hell of a commander, as we know also from his entire military curriculum. We will see other battles involving him naturally. The battle on September the 15th resulted in an unparalleled defeat for the Venetian army, notable for its severity, marking this significant moment in the hostilities between the parties. The battlefield drastically changed as Sforza's forces capitalized on their upper hand, showcasing their military prowess and shifting the momentum decisively in their favor. There is also the narrative about Francesco Piccinino's encounter with the Venetians during the critical moment of the battle. Essentially, Sforza urged Piccinino, who was positioned with his troops, to initiate an assault on the Venetian fortifications. Remember, Piccinino was among, if I understand correctly, with the Bracceschi on the left side. Surely so. And the sense was to just now overwhelm the Venetian fortifications, not giving time for anyone to rally. And of course, Sforza knew that there was still Coglioni in the camp, with also a significant amount of infantrymen that were good at defending the fortifications. And this would have brought, of course, to the destruction of the entire Venetian army if successful. However, Piccinino declined. Remember that he had already noticed himself for his lack of will for politically motivated issues. Piccinino claimed his troops needed rest after their efforts, right? And in the light of this, Sforza sought support from other leaders, including his brother Corrado and Roberto Sanseverino, to launch an attack. Unfortunately, these were spent troops, as we've seen, so now time was running out also for seizing on the opportunity. So this first attempt, the Venetian camp put up a very strong resistance. Remember, it was Coglioni from the other side. This was such a great commander of the era. And this forces the Milanese initially sent against the first fortification retreated. It's interesting. We do not know too much about the exact distribution of forces across the camp, but we can imagine like an even amount of troops. Plus, like we can think of more or less an equivalence at Fort Noble, like between, say, the Venetians and at least the Milanese forces that were employed to push the former back. The Venetians that had attacked at Fort Noble were largely cavalry, men at arms. This would have dismounted to attack the fortifications, but not only. Coglione, on the other hand, was left mostly with infantrymen. He had his own men at arms as well, but the idea is now that the Bracceschi on the left flank of the Milanese deployment would have been able to overrun with the men at arms the Venetian positions, because the infantrymen weren't as performing as these knights. Also, considering that the enemy would have suffered this very heavy blow by now, having learned of essentially of the defeat, like of the loss on their left. So surely, from a frontal point of view, you realize the Venetians could still shield themselves, like fence the enemy off, but for how long? Right now, the Milanese could have simply also moved their troops the same way the Venetians had come, and outflanking in turn the Coglione and his forces. So this is very interesting, and Sforza once again encourages his own troops, the Bracceschi on that side of the line, to renew their assault, noting that the Venetians appear to be regrouping again, so reinforcing a position that could have prevented the Ambrosians to score this decisive victory in the campaign. However, the second attempt also failed, regardless of Sforza's charisma and presence, with the Venetians successfully defending their position once again. This tells you also how effective these field fortifications really were, how like 15th century warfare at large is really a lot about all these obstacles on battlefields, this entrenchment, even of otherwise very heavy mobile troops that preferred this kind of warfare. We've seen this in many other battles, such as Formigny in the 100 Years' War, that would have been fought just, in fact, 2 years later. And I will make more videos explaining this. Again, I made lots of videos about 15th century warfare that deal exactly with this topic, but we're just at the beginning. We'll definitely show many more examples. So Simonetta's description of the battle, as we've seen, is mostly the dominant one. Then you have Sanuto and Sabellico attributing the aforementioned Milanese attacks to the Venetian fortifications actually to the Piccinino brothers. Right, so this would have not, it was again some malaise about these guys because they weren't, say, particularly well aligned with Sforza, and so it's unsurprising that Simonetta, that has a favorable idea of his leader, would talk so well about them. On the other hand, the Venetians say that the Piccinino troops were actually sent in. However, this is referred for a position in Trevi, which is very far from, it's consistently far from the battlefield, and that in fact doesn't seem to have anything to do with the battle, so it's possibly a forgery or at least a misunderstanding. There are certain things about medieval battles that are so out of place that you do not understand whether it's simply a mistake or there's no way to fit it in a broader narrative. Plus, it says with 2,000 cavalry. Well, this would have been the number of men-at-arms maybe Piccinino had together with other Bracceschi's forces. Graziani's diary aligns with, this is another 16th century source, aligns with this viewpoint, however, but only mentions Francesco's involvement, liking omitting Jacopo Piccinino due to his wounding in a previous skirmish on August the 30th. So actually confirming that that at least Francesco Piccinino would have engaged in combat at Caravaggio on the 15th of September with other troops of his. The Perugian Chronicle recounts the maneuvers of the Milanese cavalry against the Venetian forces, detailing especially Francesco Piccinino's departure with permission from the Count. We do not know what kind of path he took, but the sense is that he sort of was sent in, and in fact did actually took like an important initiative in finishing off the Venetian forces. Essentially, Piccinino's troops executed a successful maneuver, leading to significant clashes with the Venetians, ultimately overwhelming them and creating chaos that allowed Milanese forces to loot the Venetian camp, which contained valuable spoils. The mention of Trevi before could have something to do with that, because Trevi is not showed here in the picture, but it's in the far north. So it's possible that, because it happened at the time, it were marches of kilometers, right, for massive outflanking maneuvers. I studied them in numerous battles. The German flank party at the Battle of Alto Pascio, for example, were in the 14th century, but it strikes you how literally these forces could have covered literally tens of kilometers in a day just to outflank the enemy. In that case, to occupy a bridge and preventing like the escape of the enemy that drowned in the river. So this kind of stuff. So it is possible that Piccinino, that was a very famous and good leader, could have carried out such maneuver, by the way. Especially considering that this successful action eventually not only broke the Venetians, but allowed the Milanese forces to finally loot the Venetian camp, which, as we will see later, contained valuable spoils. Graziani's claim of one of Piccinino present during the main engagement seems, of course, plausible, given Jacopo's injury as well. However, Graziani expresses some sort of local pride by crediting much of the victory to Francesco. These brothers were themselves from Perugia, so Graziani's diary is mostly about, in fact, they talk about the overall Italian and also foreign history, but they would concentrate on their local commune. And I made a video about medieval Perugia, by the way. We talked about Piccinino, at least in part, given that the city gave life to him. But there is no reason to think that these accounts are really just an exaggeration. Simonetta's chronicle describes Sforza's frustration with Braceschino, whom he believed lacked fighting spirit. Again, Simonetta mostly blew the Count's horn, so to say, which prompted the Sforza to rally the Milanese troops for a more aggressive counterattack. So in this account, he's the leader that spurs the men and that is better than them as well. But that also saves the day. In fact, this determination enabled the Milanese to push the Venetians back past their fortifications. Simonetta further details how the infantry advanced, breaching enemy positions. This is extremely interesting because it shows how, actually, at least in this case, it would be the men-at-arms to break through the enemy fortifications. At this point, Bartolomeo Coglione, commanding the Venetian camp, and de facto being in charge of most of what was left of the Serenissimi's forces, chose to flee after enduring extended resistance and realizing only at that point that defeat was unavoidable. Again, there was a chance for these, especially Venetian infantry, to resist to the Milanese attacks, but also considering that even though the situation had been critical before, it had been the Venetians who had spent most of their forces in the attack, and so even before breaking, In fact, the Milanese would have to rush forces there and fight very hard, but not having like this as many troops, especially as the men at arms participated to the actual combat to stamp the Venetians, and so they had this greater punching capacity and greater general initiative and advantage available. Sabellico Nassino, also this other author Lospino, suggests an alternate account where Coglione fled on foot into nearby woods before reaching Bergamo. You have to imagine the defeat have been that disastrous that this famous condottiere had to retreat. By the way, Coglione had suffered greatly from the loss of his best friend during the engagements in the previous weeks at Caravaggio, right? And so this has been a very bitter follow-up, let's say. Ultimately, the Milanese captured the Venetian camp and numerous prisoners, more about their numbers later, including Manno Barile, who had been captured by the Venetians, as we've seen, and that had actually already escaped from captivity by himself when the Venetian army was melting away. And in fact, reportedly stole valuables from the same Gentile da Leonesa's pavilion, the guy who had mocked him before, if you remember the anecdote. It's a quite interesting scenario. During the battle's chaos near Mozzanica, Commander Micheletto and Ludovico, the Marquis of Mantua, faced the victorious Milanese forces as well. They decided essentially to hold their ground despite the overall significant setback. This really happens in all battles. When a rout breaks out, there are always some forces that decide to fight to the end to save essentially to cover the retreat of the others and saving as many troops as possible. In this case, there is an interesting flipping because they held out for a while, so living up to their reputation in that sense and managing to rally some troops even. But eventually they were forced to retreat, and they decided, if anything, to leave also many behind to secure their escape. Their capture would have been a very heavy blow to the Venetian cause. They also got a moral lesson when in their flight they encountered the Venetian administrator, Almorò Donato, whom they urged to flee. Donato refused, preferring to be captured with St. Mark's banners rather than risk the disgrace of cowardice, aware of the severe penalties from the Venetian Senate for such behavior, by the way. Venice had really a very strong political control equated by an equally efficient military organization and harsh military discipline. Their forces, in fact, Donato was captured along with the flags of the Serenissima and brought before the Sforza. Conversely, the Venetian administrator Gherardo Dandolo temporarily evaded capture by dismounting and hiding. Simonetta notes that Dandolo feared Sforza's anger, in particular for having ordered bombardments that killed Sforza's horse during the siege of Piacenza that had occurred in another context. If anything, at some time we can't even look at that. And he also had attempted to seize Cremona from the Sforza. Ultimately, Dandolo was captured near Crema by the Bracceschi forces and taken to the same Sforza. Machiavelli notably focused not on the battle but on the captured administrator's previous insults towards the Count, where he had referred to him derogatorily. And following the defeat, the administrator, regretting his past actions, approached the Sforza humbly seeking for forgiveness. And also in this case, Sforza responded in a noble, courteous way by encouraging him in that circumstance. I mean, they understood that among leaders, like being captured was terrible, was such a trauma, shock, there was all the stigma deriving from it. So he actually, encouraged him and expressed his surprise, speaking of the previous insult, So this sort of cockery that Dandolo had showed, that someone seemingly wise as Dandolo could misjudge someone like Sforza so seriously, while he remarked on his own behavior as neither blameworthy nor praiseworthy, a point that he claimed the Senate of Venice could eventually verify. Sforza advised the administrator to be more discreet in his remarks about others. As the day ended, the entire Venetian camp was taken, leading to widespread looting with only a few unarmed soldiers escaping. You can imagine all the confusion, the desertion, like how this people spread. Like there is a passage from the sources says, especially when the Venetians were broken on the left, that they looked like sheep, because they had broken the formation and they were all scattered across the meadow. You can imagine all these, especially men at arms, like their shiny armor, like they're scattering, like taking cover, hiding, running away, like also spoiling themselves because of the burden of armor. Many would, of course, make it out of there freely. In any case, this outcome represented a severe defeat for the Venetians, leaving them broken and vulnerable in the aftermath. And of course, it's a pity that in this videos we do not have the time, but for the tactical analysis. But surely, sooner or later, we will talk about, actually have something coming about, like a new cycle branch about 14th, 15th century Italian evenemential history. You can look at the political, strategical side of the story, so that by the time we arrive to 1448, or we get to 1448 anyway, the cycle is random. We will at least know what this battle would have been about, and we will see the consequences better. Also, how we had gotten there. Today we talk a bit about the events leading up to the clash. However, at the same time, needing to contextualize this even better. Speaking of the losses, this is a very important topic because of the aforementioned issue that we do not actually have an enormous evidence of a bloodbath, right? But we've seen also in the previous engagements how there were significant losses from both sides. So this is an issue of historiography mostly. I think I talked here and there in multiple videos about the difference between the medieval chronicles, the Renaissance histories, the modern and contemporary historiography, etc. Because Renaissance historiography like this one is not actually as overwhelmingly precise or detailed or insightful about different events. Here, in the age of humanism, most of historians are not really there on the field, or even when they are, as we've seen today with Simonetta and other figures that, albeit not on the battlefield, were at least controlling part of the troops arraying, like the Soldo, etc., are not, in fact, really participating. Like, they do not have any major role in the picture. They are often, not always, but at large courtier and people that are not meant even just to have a soldierly life or to be properly citizen soldiers, like, I don't know, in the late communal era where they actually went at war. They had a political and military control at times, or at least also a much more direct vision of warfare, considering the also more intense type of warfare that existed at the time. This is a topic that if you hear of the first time may be unfamiliar, but again, I made lots of videos on the topic, and there are it's like Machiavelli's prejudices that we will partly describe here. The notion that condottieri battles would have been bloodless, and we know, as a matter of fact, through the extensive amount of evidence, anyhow, of the era, that condottieri battles were that bloody. However, here, let's try to explain this lack of at least explicit evidence for major casualties, and also let's focus on what this could have been like. So Sanuto noted that the Venetians would have had just practically only, I don't remember where he says one that this is, as you understand, with tens of thousands of men clashing against one another, quite unlikely. We've seen that there were more in the previous skirmishes before the battle, so this is not very plausible, to say the least. That's what echoes, however, Machiavelli's remark about, for example, the sole casualty at the Battle of Anghiari, which we know about actually not being the case at all from other sources. And so, again, we will talk more about condottieri warfare to show you the extent of that, but also making historiographical criticism on why and how, for which reasons this was previously believed. You know, Machiavelli did not like the condottieri at all. He propagated some sort of more civic force, even though in his own very particular way, and the events of the year were in no place were going toward that direction anyhow. This, in any case, reflects a prevalent view among historians that, again, this condottieri battles would have been often quote-unquote bloodless. Sanuto reports that roughly 8,000 individuals, including both cavalry and infantry, were captured during the engagement. Of course, we're talking from the Venetian side. Among the captives were, as we've seen, the military officials Donato and Dandolo, along with the commanders Gentile da Leonessa, Roberto da Montalboddo, and Guido Arangone, that had been, again, the Marcheschi proponents of the Venetian battle plan. Other Venetian chroniclers like Sabellico and Morosini reliably support these figures. Sabellico adds that Milanese forces successfully captured the Venetian encampments, which held considerable wealth and 2,000 supply carts that would naturally help eventually the Milanese logistics. Niccolò della Tuccia of Viterbo describes the aftermath, stating that the Sforza decisively disrupted the Venetian camp, resulting in this near total rout. He also noted that very few escaped and that the Milanese forces obtained a vast amount of equipment, artisans, and merchants, leaving only 3 captains reportedly alive. This is interesting because it actually shows some dead also among the leaders, which is the interesting aspect of the story. If you pick the 8,000 captured by in Sanudo's account by Sforza, we're talking cavalry and infantry, so explicitly fighting force. You realize that essentially almost half of the Venetian army would have literally been captured. And this may be an exaggeration, even though it comes from a Venetian source, so it may not actually be far from the truth at all. Della Tuccia also states that some large siege engines, trabocchi specifically, so trebuchet, would have been captured by the Milanese, and some scholars say this is not the case because it was actually the Milanese who were besieging Caravaggio. But if you look at medieval armies, you realize that it was plenty of artillery from both sides all the time, if anything, because at large it would have been needed to storm fortifications. And there were bombards, as we will see better now, also among the artillery captured by the Milanese in the Venetian camp. But when you look at all those field fortifications, of course trebuchet would have been used, and there is actually nothing strange about the Venetians using them. Graziani recounts some letters received in September by officials in Perugia, detailing the Venetians' defeat at Caravaggio and the plundering of their camps. These letters also listed notable captives taken by the Milanese, including the aforementioned Roberto de Montalboddo and Gentile da Leonessa. Graziani emphasizes the scale of the capture, noting around 8,000 horses and significant equipment lost by the Venetians, which also a bit adds up to the previous evidence by Sanudo. Filippo Polidori, with Ariodante Fabretti, published Graziani's chronicles in the mid-19th century pointed out potential inaccuracies in the accounts as well. I think I once worked with Graziani's diary for some 13th century account, and it is a very sort of narrative, very it's a diary, but it often includes some sort of strange, say not strange, but reports that are evidently fabricated, some notions or some embellishment, nothing outrageous, but still not dating to the actual times beings. He, for example, in this case indicates several listed captives that there either weren't there or they were not really related to those he related. He said they were related to. This is not so important now, but just for stressing how there could be some sort of just strange anecdote connected to that. Dasaldo's account reiterates the figures regarding captured commanders, asserting that fewer than 1,500 of the initial 12,000 cavalry escaped, which would be like a total disaster. It mentioned that Micheletto's general captain fled with very few men. This is possible if you understand that the Venetians may have been, first of all, broken also from a psychological point of view, but they're blocked by the same swamps and forests they had previously crossed. Dasaldo's account indicates that the capture included the two provveditory, many officials, denoting a great disaster for nearly all in this case 24,000 present in the Venetian camp. There's a peace agreement document dating to October the 18th of the same year between Sforza and Venice that itemizes captives from the Battle of Caravaggio, naming prominent figures like Ermolao Donato, Ulisse Aleotti, Gerardo Dando, and key military leaders like, again, Montalbano da Leonessa, confirming the severe, say, Venetian losses in the struggle. There is the anonymous Veronese chronicler mentioning the same figures and estimating around 10,000 horses lost. So nearly all the Venetian force, which reinforces the possibility of that enormous loss. Which could explain, if you understand here the dynamic, that of course killing these people would have not been necessary if you could capture them. They would have essentially surrendered without trying to escape further. This was not really an open ground. There would have been a lot of pursuit at some point, also in the later days, but in the immediate aftermath you would have had most people captured because this was some kind of closed ground. There were trenches, there were forests, most of the Venetian men-at-arms had crossed, and notice here, so they couldn't simply come back, especially when they were broken. Notice here how the attention of the authors is focused on the horsemen. They hardly talk about infantry. Here we have Simonetta doing, so he corroborates Dasaldo's figures regarding the Venetian losses, reporting that from 12,000 cavalry, only 1,500 escaped. Some of them, of course, refer to one another. They're circular in some ways. He also says that many horses perished from exhaustion during the pursuit, and why shouldn't have this happen for the men, by the way. He also indicated that approximately 5,000 infantry were captured, and all prisoners were stripped of their belongings before release, and regardless of the ransom. Also, the infantry here would have accounted for like almost a half of the wall, which is interesting, especially considering that most of the infantry was actually connected with Coglione. And so they were broken at some point by the Milanese, but in the camp, it's in fact significant that most of the Venetian horse is captured, while not most of the infantry by these accounts. And this may have reflected the dynamic I stressed before, that most of the men-at-arms were in such an advanced position, were immediately captured in the midst of these obstacles, whereas the infantry had some easier time escaping. There was, of course, concern over security since the capture exceeded the number of victors regarding the possibility of maintaining their arms. They feared, in other words, that these prisoners were so many that they could have, of course, rebelled in arms hadn't they been despoiled of them. This was general practice, but not always. Like, some men were allowed, especially the men-at-arms, to maintain their equipment when they were captured, but it really depends on who they were. Simonetta explains that detaining so many captives was also logistically straining, considering the Milanese shortage in food and supplies in general. Moreover, the Count Ludovico Sforza was keen to seize Brescia at this point, which he believed rightfully belonged to him, making the captured soldiers an obstacle to his plans and prompting their release to expedite his campaign. This was done. If you don't have time or resources just to maintain these guys, you're already very strained. You want to move on, march on, press on. You can't strip these men of their arms. Consider the amount of stuff that is being captured in the Venetian camp, and you understand that. Sforza, bombards were taken. It's a very interesting amount of supplies, of other riches. Sforza retained only the most significant captains and Venetian senators, while the high-profile prisoners Guido Rangone and the Provveditore Gerardo Dandolo were sent to Milan as essentially a spoil of war, right, for drilling the populace and reinvigorating the Milanese support towards Sforza, then in fact, as you know, would later take over the regime of the Ambrosian Republic and re-established the Duchy of Milan for himself. These illustrious prisoners were, by the way, handed over to Milanese officials who arranged a celebratory parade featuring the captives alongside the St. Mark's banners dragged on the ground, which was, of course, an enormous insult and the ultimate shame for the defeated. They were cruelly treated in this sense. Under Sforza's command, several captains, including Gentile da Leonessa and Roberto de Montalbotto, were sent to Cremona. The condottiero Jacopo Catellano was allowed to escape by Guglielmo di Monferrato due to their friendship, and Matteo da Capo was also set free. So some of them were also recognized in their valor and left with their arms. The victors acquired significant spoils, so again, 6 large bombards, around 30 smaller pieces, like cannons. This gives you an idea of we often talk about 15th century artillery, this sense of the bigger piece and then the many smaller ones. And these were largely installed also on the Venetian fortifications that, as we've seen, were peppering the Milanese ones during the battle to distract the opponent. There are numerous carts filled with wine, grain, and fodder that help for a while, of course, to supply the same Milanese army. The Venetians left behind treasures in gold, silver, and other valuables, lots of clothing, and also pretty useless stuff for the enemy. Simonetta notes that all the soldiers, including the laborers and peasants, took away loot for themselves, which did really happen in many ways. It was just a ritual, and it happening also in civil context when, I don't know, a major leader passed away, like the same Venetian Doge the serfs were allowed to loot his apartments. Now, there were celebrations in Milan. Of course, this is also starting to be an essential for our video. Simonetta praises the captain Cristoforo Torelli, that had been appointed by the Sforza to command the rear guard and that had been essential to support the struggling Milanese soldier during the critical phase of the engagement and never abandoned his post to seize spoils. This man apparently had such an important role in the battle, and essentially Simonetta counterposes him to Francesco Piccinino. That, as we've seen in other accounts, instead credit him with the victory at the camp. So we'll never really know like whether some rivalry here, especially from the Sforza side, with Piccinino would have dictated this narrative. We understand that something concrete happened from Piccinino's side as well. On the day after the battle, the Marquis of Mantua, Lodovico Gonzaga, wrote a letter to his wife Barbara detailing survivors and prisoners, and he estimated that only 12 to 14 of his soldiers escaped, and listed several Venetian captains who managed to survive along with those captured. This also highlights that there would have been losses even at a high level. On September the 19th, there is another letter from Barbara to Paola Malatesta, that is Ludovico's mother, and she basically informs her mother-in-law about the defeat, noting that only Ludovico and 10 members of his retinue, including his son-in-law Francesco Sico, managed to escape, while the rest were captured. So it's difficult to overall conclude about the losses, but it may be that the Venetians lost over 15,000 men if we account especially a possible total of 30,000 including the non-combatants, right? This definitely indicates the collapse of the Venetian army, which is consistent with all the information that we have found. So while there is no definitive information about, for example, the dead, or even just the details, like in the difference between combatants and non-combatants, we can assess like a major chunk of the Venetian army, even most of it, to have been lost. And this was disastrous, to say the least. And also for this incredible gamble that from one side could have succeeded and brought literally Milan to her knees, but then instead produce a broader disaster for the Serenissima. This fact that there are no reported fatalities among Venetian forces, of course, does not mean that there weren't. In fact, there were no chronicles that says that there weren't. And nobody says, oh my god, this was such a huge battle, so many captured, but you see, nobody really died. It's strange. There is this minimum, like one loss at some point, but the other chroniclers do not really give us any reason to think that there weren't actual killed in this. This is also part a bit of Renaissance historiography. It's not like they cared so much about how many people had actually been killed. They looked mostly at the general demise of one cause or the other. Here, the wealth of the camp looted the prisoners. Of course, there would have been some dead. There may have not been so many, because as we've seen, Sforza even prohibited to slaughter the prisoners or do things like that. But truly, there would have been consistent losses among those forces, for example, that fought at Fort Novo. There are chroniclers mentioning many injuries. So this in part can jar with the absence of references to death, but injuries are given because you want to kill. And so we know that people killed each other in combat at that time. There are some oddities that, however, do not still deny this amount of losses. For example, Valsoldo has a tendency to focus on wartime brutality, and he offers many bloody pages in his account. However, this is the point. Even if he doesn't explicitate that there were such greater loss, actually he thought that there were few. It doesn't mean that this type of warfare was bloodless, right? It was meant to be, to begin with. So the point is circular, in many ways. We understand here that the Venetians would have collapsed in any sense. Think about, marching through the marches. Many of them would have tired themselves while walking through the marshlands before even the prolonged combat, after which they really were devoid of forces. A few were able to flee on horseback, and most surrendered. So this there would have been also a general tendency to capture the men-at-arms for ransom or for other general sense of recognition that these troops may one day maybe pass from your side or something of this kind. The question is also, like, here we talk mostly about, we've seen it, the men-at-arms. What about other forces? Would they have been so valuable just to be captured or released later? It's possible. Like, it's not like you have to slaughter everybody, and especially if there is this mass rout and likely surrender. What could happen, right? There would have been few dead for this reason, but in combat there would have been. The general meaning of this battle is eloquent. It all revolves around that major outflanking maneuver that actually shows the capacity, the competence of these Venetian forces that, as you know, were among the finest in Europe at the time. There is also a general capacity from the Milanese side to maintain control, like Sforza's intervention apparently being, say, the tip of the balance among many others in this wider balance on the scene. For the rest, we see also a clash between forces that are very similar to one another. These are armies that look alike, de facto speak alike. They are some of the most technologically advanced of the era, and they're really homogeneous in their conception, in the way they are properly fielded and organized. So overall, we appreciate a clash in conditions of symmetry, especially considering the overall numerical parity, which is also a thing for this engagement, which I'm not saying it's rare, because it ain't, but especially the bigger clashes would always be that balanced out. It's really the norm at large. What is naturally fascinating is looking at how this apparent deadlock was about to be successfully forced by the Venetians, right? And how the Milanese barely managed to handle themselves here and to save the day. So a reminder that even though there are, of course, some decisions that are pretty bad sometimes in warfare, it's never just about complete foolishness. You have to be concrete about it. Even when there is a mistake, these battles were fought out, and as such they were to be settled in a way or another, and not they weren't since the beginning. Otherwise, properly, there would have not been a fight even. So it's an interesting clash for these reasons, and also a nice addition to our to our condottieri warfare content that, again, we have not really neglected, but sometimes it just comes less as a general topic, and that we must essentially treasure for this reason also, considering that we will continue making videos on the era, and we need to familiarize further with the same for the overall diachronic and comparative purpose that we have. I have a playlist about the condottieri, I think, I created recently, and I didn't create it recently, but I think I replenished recently because I made that video about the condottieri a couple of months ago. It was very successful, by the way. Seemed to appreciate that very much, so we'll see how this goes. Of course, from one side, I would always suggest to be curious about military history. I realized something apparently dreadful for a military history-based channel. Here, maybe 10 videos about the condottieri. Well, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. I'm glad we covered that. As I was saying, the dreadful thing is that you seem to be appreciating, say, ABC history more than in-depth military history, which, from my perspective, is completely, like, I can understand the motivation, but I completely reject them. In a moral sense. The importance of military history is showing you how there is no easy answer, which is exactly what people seem to be threatened by, and that for this reason you don't want to address, like, it may be a particular part of the story. The picture in general is always green, like on Schwerpunkt you can find so many military historical content that I don't think many people really fully appreciate, and again, I feel like it's a weird feeling, because when you focus so much on it and you understand its relevance, not seeing others capturing it may be an issue. Most people go by thumbnail or topic, I think. Unfortunately, that's really not a matter of sort of objective, accurate, and solid comparative awareness, historical awareness. It's just, I want to think that this is the most important thing ever, and the rest, for an unexplainable reason, wouldn't allegedly be. This is one thing that I believe has an unprecedented relevance in history in the world. I actually, like, the motivation why I talk military history on YouTube is the same I had when I began, right? I can't, like, the more I learned about it and the more I realized how it was, I had very clear ideas. I may not know history back in the day as I know it now, but the necessity of learning military history as a broader political civic education is there, and unfortunately I don't see that around. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.